Andrew Weissman is the former general counsel at the FBI. Lisa Rubin is an MSNBC legal correspondent. Both of them were in the court this week. They've been on your televisions all week, and they both join me now. So, Andrew, I know you tweeted about this earlier, but I just want to start with what we saw during cross-examination of Michael Cohen this week. Todd Blanche basically accused Cohen of inventing a phone conversation with Trump before the 2016 election, accusing him of being a liar, which has been part of their whole strategy. Explain to us what your takeaway is of that, whether it matters or not, and if you think it was bad for the prosecution in that moment.
Great question. So I think that what we're talking about is an October 24th call where it seems very clear that at the very least, two things happened on that call, not one thing. And Michael Cohen had said on direct examination that this was one of many calls where he spoke to the president about the repayment of the Stormy Daniels hush money scheme. And on cross-examination, it was shown that, in fact, at the very least, there was also a conversation that was with Donald Trump's sort of bodyguard or valet or, helper about a harassing phone call. And so this is pretty typical where the defense has found a mistake that was made either by the DA or the witness. And of course, they are going to say, this is a lie. And that's what they should be doing. But, this happens so often in a case where someone makes a mistake and the battleground is it a lie or is it a mistake? And I think you're going to hear that kind of response from the prosecution tomorrow when they do redirect examination. And frankly, I have to say, I think it was a mistake, and it's not the end of the world because there is so much other evidence. And if you were going to lie about something, this would not be the phone call. It's not. A lot of people on air are saying this was a critical call, but I want to make sure everyone understands this is an October 24th call. This is not the critical call. If there was a critical call, it's 2 days later where the phone records make it absolutely clear that Michael Cohen had two lengthy calls with the former president. And that is when he says there was the authorization of the payment. So I think you'll hear that kind of back and forth tomorrow.
Yeah, that's super helpful as you just laid it out. And Lisa, it's impossible to get in the minds of jurors because they're 12 men and women, they're peers. That's how our justice system works. But clearly, as Andrew just laid out, this is sort of their strategy here. If you're the prosecution team and you're preparing for this next week, how do you navigate what Andrew just outlined? I mean, are you worried it's a huge problem? Are you thinking about how to address it in your closing statement? What are you doing in this moment? Or you're not worried about it because there's so much else that was already presented?
I'm slightly worried about it, and I'm not as hair on fire about it as many TV commentators have been, because the documents and other testimony surrounding Michael Cohen's narrative, Jen, are so strong. And so if I'm the prosecution, and by the way, Josh Steinglass has been writing his closing statement for weeks. In fact, as Andrew and others have pointed out, good prosecutors start with their closing statement and move backwards in deciding what their order of proof or how the evidence should come in will look like. But what I would say if I were the prosecutors is, okay, so maybe he didn't talk to Donald Trump when he was talking or calling the bodyguard. Maybe he made a mistake about that. But guess what? He didn't make a mistake about that the defense hasn't presented you with a counter narrative about. They didn't say that the document wasn't signed. They haven't shown you that David Pecker didn't have conversations with Donald Trump about it, including a conversation about repaying Michael Cohen. They haven't shown you that the conversation between Donald Trump, Alan Weisselberg, and Michael Cohen took place, where Trump approved the repayment scheme that Cohen and Weisselberg literally mapped out on a copy of a bank statement for Michael Cohen's LLC that he set up to make the payment. There's just so much other evidence that surrounds Michael Cohen and sort of bolsters him that if I'm the prosecution, yes, I'm worried about that gotcha moment, but I have so much else that I can use to remind the jury that there is no alternative explanation for how events took place other than the central narrative that Michael Cohen has taken them through and that the documents otherwise support.
So this is such an interesting thing to watch, and it was an interesting development of last week. So let's talk about the defense could call witnesses. There's this still rumor hanging out there, which I think is kind of a game, but you guys are the legal experts, that Trump could still testify. So, Andrew, I assume you don't think that's going to happen, and it's a game, but I want to know what you think. And talk to us a little bit about what the strategy is of a defense on whether they're going to call witnesses at all or who they might call.
It's not going to happen.
Thank you for breaking that down for us. Everybody's holding out hope.
Yeah, no, he's. I mean, I'd be beyond shocked, and frankly, you can tell that Judge Merchan would be beyond shocked when he heard on Friday them saying, or Thursday saying, we might call a witness. He said, okay. Anyway, summation's Tuesday. It's like, obviously, if the defendant decides to testify, that'll be a game changer. It's not happening. So I don't think we should be, engaged in sort of dangling that out as a sort of, stay tuned. I think the real issue is people getting ready for summations. Key thing to look at is the defense is going to be saying that Michael Cohen is an indispensable witness and that without him, you can't find guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And he's obviously a very problematic witness. You knew that had nothing to do with the cross-examination. That had to do with just who he is and what he's pled to. And the guy we mentioned, State here, is going to say there's just so much evidence and you have to look at all of it together. And the defense is going to be trying to say, look at it in isolation. That's a typical strategy. The defense wants you to look at each leaf and not see that there's a tree there with, a bushy tree with lots of evidence in it.
A bushy tree with lots of evidence. So, Lisa, we only have about a minute left, but you referenced Josh Steinglass has been preparing. I mean, his opening statement, what struck me even as a non-lawyer, is like he's been working on this. It's like outlined. It's so specific. It's so well constructed. It was really telling the story of the last couple of years, which was what was interesting to me. What are you expecting from his closing statement?
I'm expecting them, Jen, to play the ultimate game of connect the dots. So remember that as they've presented witnesses and testimony, it hasn't really followed a strict chronology. For example, Stormy Daniels came in at a time that didn't really cohere with the rest of the chronology. Here's where they're going to put it all together, and they're going to layer testimony and phone calls and emails and texts together to show you exactly how these deals came together, why Donald Trump was always a participant in the underlying conspiracy to elect him through unlawful means, and most importantly, that he approved of and caused others to make false business records, all 34 of them, in 2017 as he was coming up with a way to repay Michael Cohen, who at that point was no longer an employee of the Trump Organization and who therefore had to be paid through other means.
Andrew Weissmann is back with me, and joining the conversation is Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna of California. So, Congressman, I mean, this is clearly a sideshow. I mean, there's some aspects are absurd. The matching ties, Lauren Boebert being left behind, it's all a little funny. But my gut here is this is a pretty clear sign of what they are willing to do for Trump. I mean, enable him as they did in 2020. What sticks out to you here?
Well, what's sad is there's no pride or independence in being in Congress. Article 1 of the Constitution. You know, when I was elected in 2016, the same year as Trump, you had members of Congress on the Republican side who used to snicker at embarrassing statements Trump made or apologize or almost be embarrassed. Today, that has totally changed. Donald Trump is stronger in his hold on the Republican Party than he ever has been. And they basically have to go pledge fealty to him. They want to be in his cabinet. They want to curry favor with him. They want to audition for being his running mate. It's just sad.
Andrew, don't worry, I'm not going to ask you about the red tie matching strategy. I did want to ask you about the legal aspect here, because, I mean, there's some reporting that Trump was seen making edits to the remarks that his surrogates delivered. They've clearly been out there kind of making arguments on his behalf, saying things that he can't. Trump's gag order specifically prohibits him from directing others. That's in there to make public statements like this. Is there any legal ramifications, or this is just there aren't really, and there's just going to be more of a parade in the coming days?
Well, in order to find a violation, there would have to be a hearing where witnesses could connect what the folks were saying to instructions from Donald Trump. I mean, obviously there were, but whether the DA and the judge are going to be interested in doing that is another thing. I suspect they won't. But I do think your point in the introduction is the key one here, which is the tearing down of institutions. And when I think about this week, I think that you have to look at what Donald Trump says about the criminal justice system, about law enforcement, and you can see a direct line to the sort of mini-me people showing up at the courthouse, to Justice Alito with flying a flag upside down and saying in the Supreme Court that the reason presidents should not be criminally charged because you really can't trust the criminal justice system or the Department of Justice. To me, this is the through line of an enormous strain of anti-law enforcement, anti-institutionalism that goes from the Supreme Court to Donald Trump and through a swath of Congress as well.
It's so important to call that out, and I'm so glad you double tapped on that, because this is not normal. Partisan Republicans, Democrats do not typically attack institutions in the judicial system as like what we've seen over the past several months and years. I also wanted to ask you, Congressman, we heard Senator Tommy Tuberville, who said the quiet part out loud, which we can only expect from him. He also said he was disappointed in the, quote, supposedly American citizens in that courtroom. I mean, it seemed very clear he was speaking about members of the jury. He later claimed otherwise, but that also feels to me and sounds to me like the echoes of Trump language. But what did you make of those comments?
That, to me, was the most shocking of anything that was said. I mean, you have Tommy Tuberville attacking American citizens as not American, and that's the whole Trump campaign. I mean, he said that immigrants are poisoning the blood of America, and this campaign that he's running is about deciding who passes the fealty test for being a true American. And then if you're not for Donald Trump, you're not American. But I actually think this is going to end up helping President Biden, because at the end of the day, people are sick of the insults. They're sick of the character attacks, the personal attacks. We had all of that happening in the Oversight Committee. And one of the things people agree on is that President Biden is a decent human being, that he cares, that he respects the other side. And at the end of the day, I think people are going to choose that over all this chaos.
Andrew, we know, I mean, the jury is not supposed to be consuming things outside of the courtroom, of course, but all of this is happening right outside, as are many other things. Is this something, I mean, having these high-profile Republican lawmakers out there doing this, that you worry about if you're the prosecution, that the jury might consume, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, so they clearly are worried about it. There was a sidebar the other day where the prosecution raised the issue of these people tromping in and out of the courtroom in a way that was quite visible to the jury, and trying to get the judge to preclude that, to have them in their seats and not doing this. I'm reminded of during the Manafort trial in Virginia, the former president, who was then the president, was tweeting about the trial and clearly was banking on the fact that some of the jurors would be seeing that and it would affect them. I strongly suspect that we will have the same thing happen here as the case closes up this week with summations and then jury deliberations. And if I'm the prosecution and the really eminent judge here, who has just been doing a wonderful job, that's going to be the final thing that they have to worry about, is essentially a form of jury tampering by the former president of the United States.
This is something you've been warning about from the beginning, even before this. Before I let you both go, I mean, Congressman, I wanted to ask you, Lauren Boebert defended Trump from claims that he's been sleeping in the courtroom. Here's what she said in exchange with Congressman Robert Garcia.
We know that he's too tired and sleepy to stay awake through his own criminal trial. It's not President Biden who's not sharp. It's, in fact, Donald Trump.
Mr. Garcia, maybe you could just lift up that picture of our President Trump sleeping. As you say, I think he's praying. But if he is sleeping, you know, he certainly looks pretty while he sleeps.
It's a lot to unpack there. It's a large picture of Trump. What did you make of that exchange, Congressman?
Well, I think while the Republicans are engaged in a clown show of trying to defend the character of Donald Trump, President Biden is focused on actually going to places like Wisconsin, to Ravine, Wisconsin, to announce new factories and new investments in data centers. You remember the hoax of Donald Trump talking about Foxconn that never came. President Biden is delivering. And, you know, it doesn't make the headlines, but what President Biden is doing is focusing on real issues that voters care about while Republicans are engaged in antics. And that, I think, is ultimately going to prevail.
I would like to see America be more like Russia.
What do you like about Vladimir Putin?
I used to watch his videos, horseback riding back in the day.
What's happening in Russia is basically a Republican wet dream.
He's he's well-mannered.
Putin is well-mannered, right?
Absolutely.
He knows where the fork goes, where the knife goes, which window the journalist goes out of.
This is the traditional image of Americans that Russians have in their minds, that we're stupid, that we're gullible, that we smile at everyone like total idiots.
Do you think the world would be safer with Donald Trump returning to the presidency?
100%. I know without a fact it would.
Without a fact, it would be a safer world.
Okay, this looks so good. The Daily Show correspondent Jordan Klepper joins me now. So, Jordan, I mean, we've talked about this a lot before. You've famously been to a lot of Trump rallies. You've heard them say a lot of crazy things at these rallies. But why did you want to take a deeper look at this issue of Russia specifically, and why now?
Well, I think, what we've noticed over these last few months is Russia has always sort of been in part of the conversation, but we're seeing it really affect American government, American politics, and the conversation around Vladimir Putin has shifted. At one point where people on the campaign trail would just laud him being a strong man, but still criticize some of the more autocratic tendencies, we started to suddenly see people just celebrating Vladimir Putin. I believe there was even a statistic that came out that said the MAGA base, over 50% of the people think Vladimir Putin is a better president than Joe Biden. And I think this goes beyond just blatant partisanship. It's a real shift in the Republican Party that we kind of wanted to jump into and explore.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and a lot of people still don't know a lot about this. I mean, you said something earlier this week to that point that stuck out to me about how you noticed people at Trump rallies kind of shied away, as you just said, from Russia. But then when Tucker Carlson interviewed Putin, there was a kind of a shift. I mean, like Russia sort of became a gold star. Like that woman said she wants America to become more like Russia. Like what? But tell me a little bit about that shift you saw.
Well, I think the Tucker Carlson interview was a really important one. When we went out to these rallies in Pennsylvania, we went to one in Wisconsin as well, and you asked people what they thought of Moscow, more and more people pointed to the Tucker Carlson interview. Putin looks like a nice guy. He seems smart. The subways are super clean. I mean, it's very powerful watching Tucker Carlson sniff ciabatta roll. For some reason, that gets into people's minds. It feeds into the things they want to hear, and I think that's the danger of Russian propaganda. They say it's not about creating false stories, that's in there as well. It's about telling people 80% the things they want to hear and then 20% what they want you to hear. And I think folks like this see Moscow, they want to know that a place like that is better than Biden's America, and they buy into this image, and it keeps getting fed over and over to them.
Which is, it's like what the Russian propaganda machine does to their own people, which is what makes this so interesting. I've always thought Trump follows some of the playbook of that. So you kind of answered a little bit of this, but I was curious. I mean, and of course, Tucker Carlson loves grocery stores there. I don't even know. But is your sense that people are tremendously misinformed about what's happening in Russia? It sounds like you're saying maybe they just want to believe kind of the vibe that Tucker Carlson and others are projecting, or what's going on with like their level of knowledge?
I think what's interesting about this is it asks a bigger question. Is this a story about American gullibility? On some hand, yes, this idea of useful idiots, the Vladimir Lenin phrase about Americans. Like, are we just gullible wanting to believe these things? That serves Vladimir Putin. He wants a chaotic America. But there's a darker question this asks as well. How much of this is the MAGA base just being fooled by Russia? And how much of this is the MAGA base actually leaning towards an autocratic regime? They like Putin being anti-woke. They like these anti-LGBTQ policies. So there's something darker that lies underneath a lot of this. It's folks not just being swayed by Vladimir Putin, but there's something there in the way in which he treats his citizens and controls his country that is appealing to a majority of the GOP base.
So as you were putting this special together, which we're all going to watch tomorrow night, it sounds great. Did anything surprise you about kind of what you compiled and your ongoing conversations with people as you were finalizing the special?
Well, I'm starting to get used to people talking about Zelensky's yachts or Hunter Biden conspiracies. So those are somewhat rote, and I heard plenty of those on the campaign trail. But what we decided to do with this is it feels like Americans get farther and farther away from reality. And so instead of letting this special just live in the fields of Green Bay, Wisconsin, we jumped to Estonia, and I talked with the Prime Minister there. I spent some time in the woods with the Estonian Defense League, who are literally training in case Russia comes over the border and invades. And so much of this lives in theory. And when I talk to people out in the field, they tell you what the dangers could or could not be. And so for this special, we were like, let's just get closer and closer to people who are actually affected by this, people who lived underneath a Soviet regime, and talk to them about what autocracy is really like and what are the actual dangers.
And is this something we really want? I mean, despite Vladimir Putin riding on a horse, which I thought was so a funny reference point. Jordan Klepper, so looking forward to watching this. Thank you so much for joining me. You can watch The Daily Show Presents Jordan Klepper, Fingers the Pulse, Moscow Tools tomorrow night on Comedy Central at 11:30 p.m. Eastern and on Paramount Plus the following day.